So, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Criminal Justice Society, thank you so much for joining our event today on criminalization of sex work. We are honored to have with us on our panel today Professor Sharmila Parmanand from the Department of Gender Studies at the LSE. So, the way the event today will be structured is that we will start off with a speaker introduction, which will be followed by a chaired panel discussion, at the end of which we'll open up the panel to questions from the audience. If any questions do come to mind during the panel discussion, feel free to pop them in the chat and it will be asked to speakers during the Q&A session. So to begin with then, can you please provide a brief introduction about yourself and your academic research?
So hi everyone, it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much to the organizers for covering this topic and having me. So I look at the intersections between anti-trafficking discourses, practices, interventions, and sex work in the Philippines. So I'm looking at how sex work is traditionally or dominantly understood within anti-trafficking law and practice, and trying to compare that with sex workers' own reflections of their work and their lived realities. And I'm trying to see whether these align or whether there are differences in how sex workers are understood in the law and how they understand themselves and their work. And then I'm also looking at how anti-trafficking interventions affect the lives of sex workers. Does it actually increase freedom? Is it actually experienced as emancipatory, for example? So that's my work for purposes of this conversation.
Thank you so much. It aligns well with our topic today. So from your broad research and work, generally speaking, what are the social, legal, and ethical rationales that underpin the criminalization of sex work in different jurisdictions? And to what extent does our perception of female sexuality more generally shape this understanding?
Okay, I'm going to take a bit of time on this question. And the reason that is the case is because I think it is such an important question, and I think it's going to frame the rest of our conversation. There's a lot of foundational things I want to go through here. The primary motivations really for regulating sex work, especially from a criminalization perspective, are two things. One, to protect, and two, to punish, primarily women sex workers, because that's all that in a criminalization regime, they assume that most sex workers are women, right? So to protect and to punish, and these two motivations aren't even neatly distinguished, because sometimes there is the logic of punishing in order to protect. And I'm going to explain that in more detail in a little bit. I do want to emphasize two things. One, that sex work is a very diverse industry. It is predominantly women in sex work, but you also have men, and obviously you have cis and trans individuals engaged in sex work. Some of them are full-service sex workers and engage in the direct sale of sexual services. Others do it online. There are different modes. Some people are part-time sex workers and have other jobs. Some people are full-time sex workers. So it's very hard to make generalizations about sex work. A lot of my work has to do with women sex workers who are street workers or bar or establishment-based sex workers in the Philippines. So that's what I'm speaking to mostly, but that is not the entire population, right? The next thing I wanted to cover first is that criminalization takes many forms. So I think it's also important to track what forms it takes, right? So the first is the full-on criminalization, like just sex, anyone who sells sex is just directly punished for it. They are fined, they are arrested, they are jailed, right? And that goes on their record, which means it becomes harder to find jobs down the line. So if the goal was to help them, it absolutely doesn't. It really just punishes them. And then there is a softer form of criminalization, but that is still a problematic approach. And we'll talk about that as we carry on with this conversation. That is called partial criminalization. There are many names for it, right? The Nordic model, the equality model, partial criminalization. Actually, sometimes it goes by the name decriminalization because it's tried to co-opt the decrim label, but it's not actually decriminalization. So what does this model do? In theory, it's different because it treats the people who sell sex as victims, and only in theory allegedly shifts the punishments to clients and third parties. However, sex workers under this model can be rescued even against their will because they're assumed to be victims. But there are also other things that involve punishing them, right? So they cannot work together to stay safe. So if there are two sex workers who want to share a flat and work together, to make sure that clients don't take advantage, because there's always someone watching, the second person can be liable for facilitation or serving as a third party, right? Landlords have to report if if they end up having tenants who are sex workers, because then they would be liable for benefiting from the proceeds of a crime. Sex workers would still have trouble opening a bank account or buying a house under this model because they get flagged. If they are migrants, they're likely to get deported. Sex workers are still surveilled by the police under this model because even if in theory they are the victims, the police are trying to get to their clients, right? And so they still are forced to operate clandestinely. They still have a harder time screening their clients as a result. And again, they get rescued even if they're not asking to be rescued. They get rehabilitated. So you have your full-on criminalization model, and then you have your repackaged, softer criminalization model, which is quite popular in some feminist circles. Sweden has popularized this model as well. So that allegedly doesn't punish sex workers, but really still does. So these are your two models. And what are the motivations, right? Your question, what are the motivations behind these approaches? The first one is in some ways a bit more straightforward. Full-on criminalization, there's a tendency to view sex workers as immoral or indecent, as corrupting our understandings of intimacy, as endangering the family, sex work being associated with other crimes and with vice. And so criminalization also goes hand in hand with a lot of approaches to cleaning up the city, for example, or protecting our communities from immorality and vice. So those types of things. And in the second approach, the softer approach, there's an attempt to engineer a sympathetic shift here. So to see the sex worker less as a criminal, but more as a victim. And this is the approach favored by those who are trying to prevent trafficking or to prevent the exploitation of labor in the sex trade. So their solution is we should end demand by targeting the demand side to prevent the abuse of more women in the future, even if it makes it harder for the sex workers now. So that's the logic. And where is this coming from? So I think there are two parts here. One, there's disapproval because sex workers threaten sexual norms, or the fictions that we hold about sexuality, gender, relationships, right? This fiction that sex must always be tied to procreation, and normatively sex should happen within the confines of a heterosexual marriage. And women are expected to engage in this grand patriarchal bargain where we are meant to, provide sexual loyalty to just one man in exchange for his protection and his financial support. And sex workers kind of disrupt that, right? They disrupt that bargain. They refuse to play ball there. And they, in some ways, potentially threaten that model. The sex workers operate at night. They take up public space. They are visible. In many cases, they engage in sexual services with a range of different men. Some men they don't meet again, so anonymous sex, and they charge for their financial services in some cases quite directly. And so there's a lot of discomfort with this that attaches to sex work, but doesn't attach to other forms of low-waged feminized work. So there isn't the same kind of outrage for domestic work, for example, or women working in sweatshops who are paid probably far less than sex workers, and who are also subjected to sexual harassment and other disciplinary practices. But we don't put that in the same box as sex work. Anti-traffickers would still make a distinction between those forms of labor that they would consider to be superior to sex work because there's something inherently problematic with sex work, right? So and that sex workers need to be disciplined in that sense for stepping out of line. The second is the idea of victimhood as a political identity and victimhood tied to sex. So from this perspective, sex is seen as a source of danger or a source of peril. As a site, I'm sure many of us who have done feminist theory here. So sex is seen as a site of masculine oppression, and it's a way for women to be subjugated. So we have a very sex negative perception. It's also seen as objectifying women. So in sex work, many opponents of sex work would describe sex work as women selling their bodies. But sex workers do push back against this and say, no, we're not selling our bodies. We're selling sexual services. We're selling contracted services, right? But the association of women engaging in sexual acts as being so essentially bound up with their identities, as so defining of their identities, that you almost get reduced to it. So the assumption being made here is once you sell sexual services, you're selling such an essential part of yourself, which is not how it's always experienced by sex workers. But that's a generalization that's made. And so the conclusion is sex work is so dehumanizing and objectifying that there's no possible way that it can be consensual. And those who think that it is consensual, there's something wrong with them, right? And then they get pathologized. They get told, you don't know what's in your interest. You are too damaged. You are too traumatized. You're a bad feminist. You're a servant of the patriarchy. And so they are talked over and told, no, you need to be rescued. We need to save you. So we know what's better for you, right? So that's all these impulses at play behind criminalization. And in all these models, sex workers have been excluded from the conversation. I hope that answers your question.
That really does. Thank you. That provides a really clarifying picture of the ideas that underlie both our social perceptions as well as existing policy responses. So moving on from that, you've really written about how you've explored the voices of sex workers in the Philippines and how it hasn't been heard in the formulation of anti-trafficking policies. So from your research and your experience interviewing sex workers, what kind of policies do they see as being best oriented towards safeguarding their interests and what they would like to see implemented?
So 5 things, actually. The first is a general policy that applies to all workers, all precarious individuals, really, which is poverty alleviation, social protection. So the first thing that we need, and sex workers aren't unique here, and I think it's also important to kind of de-exceptionalize sex workers, is if we had better access to healthcare, better access to education, transport infrastructure that works, accessible food, living wages, etc., their vulnerabilities will decrease. And some of them might choose to exit sex work. Some of them may still continue to do it, but from a stronger bargaining position relative to their clients and their managers, because they will be better able to say no to clients they don't want, to working conditions that they're unhappy with, if they have a good fallback position. So the first ask is social protection. The second ask, and this one is more specific to sex workers then, is that they need to be meaningfully included in discussions about them, especially discussions that have strong policy impact, right? In these conversations, the security sector is overrepresented. So we always talk to law enforcement and the cops about policies that directly affect sex workers. There are also professional feminist organizations, some of whom have no contact with sex workers, don't have sex workers in their board or in their leadership structure, don't bother to consult with sex workers, right? Or who represent trafficking survivors. And their voices do need to be heard. That's very important. So survivors of sexual exploitation need to be heard. But at the same time, they cannot be taken as representative of the experience. Their experiences are not representative of everyone else who has been in the sex industry. So that would be like saying, we're going to speak only to trafficked individuals when we're trying to design policy in agriculture or in factory work or in mining, for example, right? So there are certain constituencies that are increasingly overrepresented, but sex workers are not. So they would like I think it's important to meaningfully consult with sex workers, listen to what they have to say, because they are experts on this matter, right? The third is to remove criminalization. So treat it like any other work, decriminalize it, remove criminal penalties for sex workers, for clients, and for managers. This doesn't mean anything goes, because like any other job, when abuses occur, then you should have legal recourse. So obviously, this is not taking out the legal recourse to protection. This is just removing the a priori criminalization of an entire class of work, right? The fourth is destigmatization. So this requires more cultural and social interventions, because this cannot just be top down, although the law has a normative effect. So obviously changing the law does have that does have an impact, but also just destigmatizing language around sex work. And finally, not over-regulating it as well. So there's a difference between decriminalization and legalization, right? Because over-regulation can backfire, because then it creates multiple tiers and it creates new forms of criminalization again, right? So no mandatory registration, which requires sex workers to reveal their identity and, which is a violation of their privacy. No mandatory health checks, no hard zoning, for example. A lot of there are natural incentives already on the part of sex workers to have themselves checked, for example. So there's no need to overly regulate it. Migrants should be allowed to also engage in sex work, because that restriction then leaves them vulnerable, right? So those are the 5 main asks, at least in the context of the Philippine Sex Workers Collective. But this seems to be consistent with the demands of global sex worker rights movements.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It provides a very comprehensive picture. So to get down to maybe a little bit more detail about in your research, you've written about how sex workers are exposed to police violence. To what extent does the law's present approach to sex work, or maybe its uncertainty surrounding its regulation, contribute to enabling this kind of misconduct, either from the police or from those in power in general? And what is the impact of that on sex workers?
So in the context of the Philippines, there is a lot of legal ambiguity around sex work. So we have the penal code, which says that the sale of sex is a crime, right? But then we also have the anti-trafficking law, which says it is the purchase of sex that is a crime, and that sex workers are actually victims. And then we have the Magna Carta of Women that says the same thing as the anti-trafficking law, right? But then we have a bunch of like labor code provisions that seem to suggest that sex work should be allowed as work, or that it happens. So you now have this confusing mix of laws. That's in the context of the Philippines. In the context of the UK, for those who are interested, buying and selling sex is allowed. So that part is legal. Everything else around it is not. So everything else that a sex worker could possibly do to make it safer, like working in a flat with someone else, is not legal. Having a support staff or having a third party to help screen clients or manage clients or recruit clients is not, right? So in the context of the Philippines, the ambiguity is quite pronounced, but even in the UK, there is that murkiness, right? And so when there's ambiguity, more power asymmetries are created between law enforcement and sex workers. And even here in the UK, recently a report was released on the status of the police, right? And it wasn't a very rosy picture. So in the Philippines, what's happened is sex workers don't know which set of laws are being used to regulate them at any moment in time. So in their encounters with the police, they don't know whether they're being arrested or they're being rescued, and they're never sure, right? And what's happened is you just have a preemptive, almost microeconomy of bribes, right? So cops are able to take advantage of this and demand that sex workers pay them bribes ahead of time. So it's literally hand delivered to the police station at this point to ensure that they don't get arrested, so that they're left alone. And so sex workers who don't pay the bribes are the ones who get arrested. And so there's a collective action problem. You just end up paying. Or performing sexual favors. Well, that's actually assault or rape, right? In exchange for not getting arrested, or, they get arrested and then so that they can get let go. And this intersects with other social phenomena, like, for example, the war on drugs. So I'm sure many people have heard about Rodrigo Duterte's incredibly violent war on drugs, which involved a massive expansion of police powers. So the police were essentially told they could act without accountability and just murder people without trial for as long as they could demonstrate on a very thin basis that they were in possession of drugs, right? Now think of how easily this has grafted onto sex workers, because the police can just threaten to plant drugs in them, and have, right? So many sex workers have experienced being told, I can easily kill you, or I can easily book you for a drug offense if you don't give me your money / you don't perform sexual favors. So the drug war has been weaponized against sex workers too. And they do not have legal recourse in a situation where the law is confusing, because there's still a law that can be used to justify locking them up, right? But even if they are rescued, the process has been traumatic, and not everyone wants to be rescued. So in the face of this ambiguity, it's just the police really that wins. And it's no surprise that they are in favor of preserving this ambiguous situation, right? Like, obviously, it's dressed up in the name of protection. Oh, we need to keep criminalizing this to protect sex workers. But in the words of the sex workers I interviewed, who are our real pimps and who are our real traffickers? Because their encounters with the police suggest that it's actually the police behaving like pimps, right? So the clients they fear the most are the cops, because they're the ones who don't pay, and they're the ones who demand these things for free. So the bottom line here is that law enforcement, no matter what kind of police training we give, so these things mitigate some of the harms perhaps, but they're never going to fix structural problems with the police as an institution that is, an institution that has never been kind to gender and sexual minorities or to gender dissidents, and that it's very hard to extract accountability because they look out for each other, right? And so law enforcement cannot be our plan A in our attempt to protect sex workers. I'm not saying that there's absolutely no place for them, because I understand if a sex worker is raped, and this sex worker wants to bring forward a case, there might be a role for law enforcement there. I mean, the English Collective of Prostitute helps sex workers bring forward these cases, but they cannot be our central strategy in protecting sex workers. It has to be something else. It has to be social protection. It has to be workers' rights. It has to be allowing sex workers to unionize.
Thank you. And I think that really sets the picture for our next question, because clearly there's a lot of institutional failure, social stigma. So in the face of all of this, and within the limits of a hostile legal environment, what are the strategies that sex workers collective can adopt to effectively operate? And how can sex workers' safety nets be used by sex workers to protect themselves outside of existing policy regimes?
So I'll speak a lot to the Philippine case, but much of this is applicable across a more global context. I'll also say that there are certain strategies that I would rather not discuss publicly, because they are safety risks, right? And part of doing ethical research with stigmatized and marginalized communities is also knowing when not to say things publicly. But the things that I can say publicly are, that personal safety is very, very important. So the collective has done a good job, after being burned several times in the past, of protecting the safety of individual members. And what does this look like? This looks like not publicly disclosing the identity of their members. So if they speak, it has to be cameras off, for example, or disclosure, but in more vetted and semi-private spaces, so very selected audience. Strict rules of engagement with the media and academic researchers to ensure that their privacy is respected. Second, having a very, very strong and consistent social media presence. So this allows them to, register their opposition, given that they're being excluded from all other official conversations, to react to policies, to present counter research, to oppose, for the record, what's going on. And they do have a huge following on social media. Third is mutual aid networks. And we've also seen that happen in the UK. So SWARM, one of the sex worker organizations operating in the UK, put together a mutual aid fund during the pandemic for sex workers who were hit by hardship. So where does this go in the context of the Philippines? Bail money for sex workers who are arrested, distribution of health kits and condoms, covers rent or hospital bills for those who might need it. The next is forming strategic alliances. So there might be political groups or political actors whose interests might not be explicitly pro-sex work, but are adjacent to sex work, who might share similar politics, or who do engage with sex workers as well in the course of their work, and who also believe in destigmatization and decriminalization. So these might be some, not all, some LGBT organizations, HIV/AIDS organizations who have found that criminalization actually makes their work harder. Some progressive feminist and queer organizations, these are usually younger and newer organizations. Certain allies in media and academia who can help generate research that can eventually be used to persuade policymakers, but that is obviously a very, very long game. And in the context of the Philippine Sex Workers Collective, international collaborations to help amplify their voice, because in the face of very limited local collaborations, that does help. So there is a global sex worker rights movement. So those are the strategies that they've adopted that have had limited success, but there's never this is not a fight we're gonna win in our lifetime. We've made peace with that.
Thank you. That does provide a clear picture of that. So this brings us to our final question, and I think one that I'm most looking forward to your opinion on. So what is your opinion on radical feminist arguments of commercial sex as being a form of violence against women and irrational for the abolition of sex trade? And how would you conceptualize the way that we think about and we talk about sex work as a society?
So I too do not agree with a happy hooker myth, right? So there are some people who are in the minority, who might defend sex work, who will also overly romanticize it, right? Like, oh, look at all the money you can make, and some women are really happy with their lifestyle, where they are privileged sex workers. And I agree that within sex work there is a hierarchy. Some people will refer to it as the hierarchy, right? Most sex workers are doing this because they need a job, in the same way we are all doing our work because we need our work. You are not going to go up to a cleaner and ask them, was this your dream job? Are you going to do this if not for the money? Most people work for the money. That is a reality, right? And that is the reality for most sex workers too. So I accept that. I accept some of the premises, actually, of radical feminists, that a lot of times it is poverty and economic desperation that drives people to enter into sex work. So I'm not going to deny that. I think it's important to acknowledge that. And it's also important to acknowledge that some of these women would really rather not be there, right? And then some of them do feel a bit uncomfortable about what they have to do. And some of them do experience dissociation while undergoing this work. In the same way, many of us actually do experience dissociation in our working environments. But that's where the agreement ends, because I do not have the same deterministic conclusion as a result, which is that it is inevitable that it is violence against women. It is inevitable that women are going to be dehumanized here and deeply traumatized. Why is that? Because we need to listen to sex workers and how they describe their work, right? And in my experience, and I've spoken to many of them, they are not naive. This is a calculated, conscious decision that they have made in light of the very limited options that they have. This is not about not fighting for better options, because that's always on the table. All of us are always fighting for better options. But the world being what it is now, right? Like, we can't magic wand away the limitations that exist in our world. We can't just, wish options on the table that don't exist. Some of them have worked in factories. And when they worked in factories, they were harassed by their managers as well. For every 5 minutes that they were late to work, they experienced salary deductions. When they didn't meet their quota, they experienced salary deductions. They were given 5 minutes of an entire day for bathroom breaks. Some of them developed arthritis, back pains, UTI, and all of these things. And they were far away from their kids. Many sex workers are mothers who have carrying responsibilities. In the context of my work, most of them were single mothers for extended periods of time, right? With young children. So the inflexible working hours of some occupations simply did not cut it for them, right? In the Philippines, we have a lot of workers who go overseas to work. I mean, I'm an overseas working migrant myself, but like a lot of women work as domestic workers overseas, for example. They didn't want to do that because they didn't want to be away from their kids and they couldn't afford to be away from their kids. Also, that comes with its own set of risks. You are incredibly vulnerable. You're living in a foreign country where you're treated as a second-class citizen. You live with a foreign family, sometimes that speaks a different language, in their private home, and are exposed to a lot of risk as well. And a lot of times when you get there, you already have been in debt. So that's not necessary from all the transaction and placement fees that you had to pay to get there, right? So that's not even a superior option, right? What other options exist, like working as hairdressers? How many hairdressers can you really have in a village, right? Working in factories, as I've addressed already, working as sales clerks, where we have increasing casualization in the labor force, so they're never going to get to a point where they're entitled to benefits, for example. There's also a lot of age discrimination in the labor market. So these were their alternatives. Some of them actually worked in these jobs, but went back to sex work. Or some of them do these jobs and sex work alongside, right? And sex work is part of a series of income-generating strategies. So listening to these women, it's not clear to me that sex work is the worst of their options, actually. And in fact, some of them, when they thought that I was also the usual traditional interviewer who was trying to rescue them, said to me, what, you're going to give me a broom? And you're going to take me away from the bar and put me in the kitchen? That's your idea of liberation, right? And another one also said to me, in what relationship are you expected to provide sexual labor for free? And if you don't provide it, there's actually risk of violence. And you get nothing in return, very little in return. And I was like, what relationship? And she was like, my marriage, right? And it is true. This is a widely recognized fact that some women, women are at risk of domestic violence in marriage, in heterosexual, actually in all relationships, right? And yet we're not trying to ban marriage. We're not framing marriage as male violence against women, even if that abuse is well documented. What we're doing is we're trying to strengthen women's bargaining position within marriage. So the point she made was she was able to leave her abusive marriage, actually, through sex work, which she described as fucking her way from no freedom to some freedom. Because if she's going to provide it anyway, she might as well get paid for it. Is this the end point we want for women? No. But is she better off than her starting point? Yes. And certainly according to her, yes, right? And so it is a way out of some abusive relationships for some women as well. So that's another direction it's taken. So I think clients are terrible people, which I think is something we need to address. First, I don't think clients are monolithic, right? They are also a very diverse group of people. Second, yes, there are some clients who are really not great people. There are some clients who are in there to objectify the women. I think it's important to call a spade and to not romanticize the clients, right? But at the same time, that doesn't mean women are just puppets in this equation, right? What they are selling is not their bodies, is not themselves. They are selling the fantasy of submission, not actual submission. It's a contracted relationship, right? And so this doesn't mean that by agreeing to provide sexual services, they've agreed to anything goes. And in fact, it's quite dangerous to perpetuate that kind of rhetoric. That's exactly what we should resist. And that's exactly why they want rights, right? But what about the sex workers worker's own reading of the situation. So the client may go in there reading it as objectification, but the sex worker is not a passive actor in this encounter. The sex worker can also say, well, for me, I am co-opting your fantasy, and that's how this is going to happen because I have money. I need money from this transaction, right? So it is important to recognize that there are two voices in this interaction or more, and to not just assume that what the client believes or thinks about it is the case, right? So I think there is room for resistance here. I don't want to overplay resistance in sex work, as I keep saying, to the extent that we live in a capitalist economy that values our ability to hustle and to be resourceful and to make do with what we have, the makeshift economy type situation. That's what sex workers are doing. They are no different to other workers. The last objection, I think, to sex work is, but then supposedly sex workers kind of signal to the world that it is okay for men to objectify women, which is an analysis I'm not really comfortable with, because we cannot put the burden of smashing the patriarchy on the backs of our most vulnerable workers. No one goes up to factory workers and tells them, oh, wow, you are responsible for propagating capitalism. And yet we're doing it. We're doing it to sex workers. First, I do think that they are reconfiguring the patriarchy in individual encounters. But second, this is not their burden. If that's what we wanted to fix, we're not imposing that on other occupations. We're not going up to domestic workers and saying, oh, you're reinforcing the fact that women are caregivers, or the undervaluation of women's caring roles. But somehow we have decided to do that to sex workers, which is not okay.
Thank you so much. I think that really clarifies the picture between, one hand, the question of empowerment, and on the other hand, realizing that this is not the end goal for women and that there's so much more that we can do. I think that was a very great conversation overall, and I think it's time for us to open up the panel to questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, there are a couple in the chat that I can ask. But before that, if anyone has any questions that they would like to switch on their videos or just their mics and ask, you can do so right now. Or I can move on to the chat. Is anyone good? Then I'll just move on to the chat. I think there was a question around your research. So you've mentioned that a couple of times, and the question is basically, how did you find talking to sex workers? How did you go about it? What were the challenges you faced, and why you chose such a method of research?
Thank you. I think the methodological dimension of my research is one of the most complicated but also fulfilling aspects of the research. I want to say one thing off the bat before I go into details. One, I think am I online? Can you see me? Okay, very good. So one is that academic research and research of this kind, I think it will always be extractive. There is no way for it to not be extractive, right? We need to recognize that. And having recognized that, we need to try to mitigate it. We will never be able to fully mitigate it, right? It's an impossible task. And that is part of grappling with being in a university and trying to decolonize research and all of that. But we need to try to mitigate it. So that was the approach I was taking here. Why this research? I used to work in anti-trafficking, and I used to actually believe the exact opposite of what I'm saying right now. So I used to actually believe in the rescue approach and participated in some of these police raids, actually. And so there was a lot of guilt there when I realized the harm of what I was doing. And I realized it because there were sex workers who were escaping from the shelter that I helped manage. And there were sex workers being very angry at having been rescued. And I was looking at this and thinking, if we are doing so much good here, why does it look like we're not actually helping people? There are a bunch more experiences, which I'm happy to explain, that made me realize I may be in the wrong here. And so I thought that because we had not listened to sex workers at all, I wanted to devote my research to actually foregrounding what the sex workers had to say in the context of the Philippines. So with that in mind, I approached the collective. And their initial response to me was absolutely not welcoming. In fact, it was quite hostile. So they said, we don't trust feminist academics. We don't trust researchers. You just mine us for data and then you leave and your lives improve and you use this as a professional stepping stone, but we're still here and we gain nothing. Not to mention that you weaponize our stories to fit your pre-decided agenda of criminalizing sex work. And that's true. When I started talking to them, there was a hesitation to talk to me about the violence they experienced at the hands of clients because they were afraid that I would use that information to support a conclusion that they did not agree with, which was criminalization or partial criminalization, right? So there is a lot of that, like anger and legitimate anger and injury that they've experienced historically. They were also concerned that, their privacy won't be respected, that I would also be talking to the cops, that I could get followed, that academics take platforms that belong to them, which is why I am very conscious about which speaking engagements to take and which ones to pass along to the sex workers, for example, and say, no, they are the ones you need to be asking. And a range of other concerns. So in the end, I listened. I just kept listening and apologizing, actually. And they decided, okay, maybe we can trust you. But they were very, very clear. They said, we will work with you, but let this not be construed as a benevolent action on your part, because we do not need saving. And that is sometimes the approach that's taken by researchers, academics, journalists who work with them. Sometimes it's very well-intentioned, but it's still very patronizing. It's still a form of paternalism that assumes we know better. We really do not know better, right? And so they made that very clear at the start, which I appreciate because in the terms of our relationship were clear from the beginning. And I said, absolutely. I think of you as a partner in this research project, as a collaborator, as a partner in knowledge production. And having them with me in the research process was incredibly helpful because they helped me determine how to ensure that I wasn't taking advantage of participants, how to ensure that I was keeping my participants safe, and how to recruit interlocutors, how to frame the questions in a way that wasn't too confronting or that wasn't re-stigmatizing. So I had one question, which was, do you enjoy your work? To which they said to me, are you going to ask a cleaner that? And I was like, probably not. And then they were like, so why are you asking of sex workers? To which I said, that's fair. And I revised it to, what is the best thing you like about your job and what is the worst thing you like about your job, right? So just these things that were really, really important, making sure that I was as ethical as I could be towards my interlocutors, having them sometimes sit in on the group conversations, also help put the interlocutors at ease. So that's one thing. The other thing methodologically that I want to highlight is I used collective storytelling as a method. I think the interview as a method is incredibly unnatural. People are not used to being interviewed. I'm not used to being interviewed, right? So you don't expect sex workers who normally don't have people asking them about their thoughts on policy. In fact, they're used to just being told, suddenly feel comfortable in an interview setting. So that just wasn't a match, right? So I did collective storytelling sessions, which were a bit more informal. It involved food. In some cases, it involved dancing and karaoke. It had a more social vibe. And not only was it generative, like academically or even politically, some of the sex workers who met in those sessions have ended up becoming friends. And, they describe the sessions as like therapy in some ways. So it's also a source of recreation, of psychic relief, of them making sense of things together, because it's very hard to get those spaces, right? So yeah, there is a lot of thought that went into methodology here. I'm sorry, the last thing I'm going to say, and then let's take more questions, is the danger with talking to stigmatized and marginalized populations is if you are not an ally, and a real one, not a performative one, or if you are coming there from a position of saving or judging or pitying, people pick up on that really quickly. In fact, that is their default assumption of you. And you know what? It's fair. That was the default assumption of me as well. And I didn't take offense at that, right? But then people are going to tell you stories that they think you want to hear. They'll tell you the sad stories because they want to avoid awkward conversations. They would like to avoid being confronted or judged if they said that they actually enjoyed some aspects of their work, right? And so that's a very real risk. And that was something that I had to work very hard to overcome.
Thank you. That really explains how the degree of sensitivity at which you had to approach what is clearly a very difficult and sensitive topic. And I'm hoping that answered the question. So I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So I'm going to pick out 2 from the chat. And so one person has asked regarding an existing policy or regulatory framework in any part of the world that you think is ideal, or at least a starting point for better approach to sex work more generally.
Do you have the second question as well? Maybe you can just answer them one after the other.
Yeah, the second question is around migrants. So you've mentioned migrants and how they should be involved. So are there any special policy considerations or regulatory approaches that should be adopted regarding that?
Thank you for these 2 questions. They're very good questions. So the first one, I would say New Zealand. So there are and I think it has to be, and actually thank you for this question because it gives me a chance to clarify. Not all legalization models are great, right? Some are quite bad. The Nevada model is very, very bad. Why? It restricts sex workers to a particular area, which reinforces the moral and geographical boundaries, right, between them and everyone else. It only allows them to work in brothels, which then gives brothels monopoly over them and their lives, right? And so they can't work in cooperatives, they can't work together, they can't freelance. So that's not an empowering model. And that's not a model sex worker rights groups would stand for, right? So the best model thus far is the New Zealand model, which is a decriminalization model. So this just allows them to work freely, to claim benefits from the state for the work that they do, and also to report abuses when they arise. And I haven't actually seen any other place where sex workers have a reasonably, it's not great, but a reasonably productive relationship with law enforcement, as in New Zealand, because they actually do have the power to go up to the police and say, these abuses have transpired. Can you help us address it, please? They also have bargaining power vis-a-vis employers, vis-a-vis brothels, and establishment owners. So I would say, look to the New Zealand model. I think some states in Australia are trying to adopt that model as well. So I'm not the biggest fan of that. The only issue I have with the New Zealand model is they still don't allow migrants to engage in sex work, which again is a problem because then the migrants are vulnerable, right? And then they're going to have to rely on third parties or unscrupulous third parties who then overcharge them. And then that makes them vulnerable as well to unscrupulous border control officials or police officials. But so there's no perfect model out there yet, but New Zealand is probably the best one we have. And in terms of migrants and policies, so I think it's important to think about this both from the country of origin and the country of destination. So countries of destination, I think all of them, don't allow migrants to engage in sex work. Or they may, but through a very opaque and circuitous process. So like Singapore, for example, there is a process, but the process is not published anywhere. So you kind of are sometimes issued yellow cards, but it's unclear exactly how this comes about, right? So given this opacity, migrants then can still be taken advantage of by third parties, right? So I would say countries of destination should allow migrants to engage in sex work. And that doesn't mean that I don't think we should care about human trafficking or abuse. Obviously, when that happens, there should be legal recourse for that. So there should be avenues to report it. But I'm not sure why we would a priori disallow it, right? Because that just creates new vulnerabilities. In fact, that's where the vulnerabilities come from, because then migrants have to do it underground, or they have to take illegal, they have to use illicit means to get into the destination country, for example. Now, from countries of origin, and I'm speaking particularly in the context of the Philippines, we also over-police people who the country as a preemptive measure because we are afraid that they will engage in sex work overseas and because we must protect them from trafficking. What we do is we bar a lot of people from leaving the country in the first place. So every year, around 40,000 Filipinos are offloaded. These are people who are already in the airports waiting to board, right? But who are not allowed to. 70% of them are women. So there's like gendered paternalism at play here again. And on quite subjective standards. So there's the whole, if your passport is fake, fine. But there's also just things like how you're dressed, whether you have a return ticket, whether you look confused or lost, whether you're saying that your foreign partner paid for your ticket, but the immigration officer didn't believe you, whether you don't have current employment, so you're then not allowed to board, which is a lot of money lost for people, right? Those are tickets, those are hotel reservations. And not to mention that a record of being offloaded makes it harder for you to travel later on again. And so we do have women who do engage in sex work overseas. What they have to do instead is try for illicit migration routes, which again exposes them to more harm, right? So at the end of the day, overregulation always creates underground transactions, which then leaves people more vulnerable. Like we're better off relying less on restrictions and more on rights and social protection, and then intervening when there are cases of abuse, rather than overly restricting people's movement or activities.
Thank you. I think it really answers those questions that the audience had. So because we have a couple of minutes left, I think I'm going to ask a quick question from my side. So I think we had this whole conversation and we mostly focused on women. So I was wondering, is it possible, and is it even necessary to maybe have a broader context, maybe a broader gender-based approach to sex work, maybe even including men and people from other genders? And what is your quick take on that?
Yes, 100%. And there are people who are doing this work, I should say. I had a very specific agenda for zeroing in on women in the context of the Philippines. It's because I really wanted to challenge the assumptions in the anti-trafficking sector. And a lot of their assumptions are based on the most vulnerable sex workers. So these are women, street workers, and establishment-based workers, right? And I wanted to challenge that. So I was like, I'm going to look at your paradigmatic cases and tell you that on your terms, on your grounds, your assumptions don't hold and are actually causing harm. And I thought that direct comparison would be easier if we talked about the same cases they were talking about. But I agree with you, because increasingly the policing has also started moving in the direction of like other forms of sex work, even if it's not just women sex workers, right? So increasingly male sex workers have also been arrested in the Philippines in sting operations. So, and I think that's starting to happen globally. Or online sex work is a more reversal space, I guess. Like you do have people of different genders engaging in sex work online. And the policing of online sex work is harmful across the board. And how does this policing look like? Financial payment services are shutting down accounts of sex workers. So MasterCard, Visa, PayPal, all these companies say, if we suspect that you're a sex worker, we're going to shut down the account and we're going to seize your funds and you won't get it back, right? So a lot of sex workers have lost money that way. And so they can't take payments securely from their clients. So yeah, that's not just affecting women, right? So that's also a conversation we need to have. Plus, if our argument is, sex work and its effect on gender norms, it's worth thinking about how norms are reconfigured in the context of like not just cis women. Because in my interviews with trans women, for example, their reflections on sexual norms are also a bit different in the context of sex work. So there are two things that stood out. One, many of them are using sex work to pay for gender affirming surgery, in which case sex work was actually gender affirming for them in the end, not gender harming, right? And second, they experienced the process of interacting with clients as gender affirming. So one of them actually said, look, in a world that constantly misgenders me, here I'm actually treated like a woman, right? So these are very different experiences that we can't just generalize as male violence against women, right? But yes, I agree with you that the short answer is absolutely we must look into this.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to conclude our conversation, and also really sets a broader picture to bring to these kind of conversations in the future. So overall, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. This was a really great event and provided some really strong ideas that our audience will surely think about. And thank you to the audience for joining us today and for our final event as a society this year. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening ahead, and we hope to see you next year for our events as well. Thank you.